She set the bread on the porch railing and said she'd made too much. I told her she didn't have to keep doing this. She said she knew. That was 2 years ago, and I still haven't figured out what she meant by that. My name is Cole Mercer. I'm 48 years old, and I farm 180 acres of wheat and cattle just outside Millbrook, Montana. The land belonged to my father before me, and his father before him. 3 generations of the same soil, the same sky, the same creek running along the south boundary. I know every fence post on this property. I know which gate sticks in March, and which field floods first when the snowmelt comes too fast. I have spent more of my life on this land than I've spent anywhere else in the world, and most days, that's enough. 2 years ago, my wife Anna died. We'd been married 19 years. She was the kind of woman who made every room feel deliberate, who kept the books for the farm, drove supplies into town, grew tomatoes in the back garden, and somehow still had time to remember everyone's birthday. The cancer gave us 8 months of warning, which people kept telling me was a mercy. I never understood that word in that context. Knowing something is coming doesn't mean you're ready for it. It just means you have longer to sit with the weight of it before it lands. The morning after the funeral, I went to the barn at the usual time. Not because I was strong, just because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I've kept to that routine every day since. The cattle don't know what year it is. The wheat doesn't care. The land asks the same things of you regardless of what's happened inside the house. And for 2 years, that sameness was the only thing I trusted. The property to my east belongs to the Brooks family. Frank and Diane had farmed it for 30 years. 50 acres of pasture and greenhouse vegetables, a small dairy herd of goats, the kind of operation that ran on hard work and careful margins. I'd known them since I arrived here as a young man. Their daughter Hannah had grown up on that land, gone south to study agricultural science, and come back 3 years ago at 23 to run the place herself when Frank's back gave out and Diane's eyes got bad. I had watched Hannah Brooks grow up from a girl who climbed their fence posts to a woman who fixed her own tractor and negotiated contracts with distributors twice her age. By the time she took over the farm, she was running it better than Frank ever had. She wasn't someone who needed looking after. She just happened to live next door. The bread started on a Sunday in October, 6 weeks after Anna's funeral. I heard boots on the porch steps and opened the door, and there was Hannah Brooks, standing in the early morning cold, with a linen-wrapped loaf in both hands and flour on her wrist. She hadn't noticed yet. "I made too much," she said. "You can help me get rid of it." I knew it wasn't true. I took the bread anyway and told her she didn't have to do that. "I know," she said. And then she went back across the field without waiting to be invited in. After that, she came every Sunday morning without announcement. Sometimes it was bread, sometimes preserves from the greenhouses, sometimes a pot of soup still warm from the stove, sometimes just 2 cups of coffee and a thermos, one for each of us, already made the way I took mine. I never asked her to come. I never told her not to. She would stay for half an hour, sometimes less, sitting on the porch railing or the old wooden chair beside the door, talking about her goats or the irrigation line she'd been fighting with, or asking my opinion on a piece of equipment she was considering. She never made the silence feel like something that needed to be fixed. I kept her in a specific place in my mind during those 2 years. Neighbor, family friend, the girl I'd watched grow up through the fence line, Frank and Diane's daughter. I held on to those words with some care, because somewhere underneath them, something else was forming, and I had decided without examining the decision that it wasn't something I had the right to look at directly. It was a Sunday in late September, when everything shifted. Hannah came across the field, carrying a jar of apple preserves. "The first batch of the season," she said, "from the trees along the south boundary." She set the jar on the porch railing and leaned against the post with her arms crossed, the way she did when she was settled and in no particular hurry. The morning was cold and clear. The wheat field behind the house had already been cut, and the land looked wide and pale under the early light. I was drinking my coffee and watching the tree line, and I said something without thinking about it first. You shouldn't waste your Sunday mornings on someone my age. I meant it as a mild self-deprecation, the kind of thing you say to fill a pause. Hannah didn't treat it that way. She went still, not startled, not offended, just still, the way she sometimes went still when she was deciding something. She looked at me for a long moment, with that level, unhurried gaze she had. Then she picked up the jar of preserves and set it in my hand. You keep saying things like that, she said. I keep not believing you. She walked down the porch steps and across the field without looking back. I stood there with the jar in my hand and watched her go. The words stayed in the air after she disappeared, behind the tree line. I keep not believing you, all day while I checked the herd, and repaired the east gate, and drove the truck into town for supplies. Those words kept coming back. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just Hannah being direct the way she always was, cutting to the point without any decoration. But the more I tried to set it aside, the more clearly I saw what I hadn't let myself look at for 2 years. She hadn't been coming across that field because she had leftover bread. She hadn't been learning how I took my coffee by accident. And the way she had said I keep not believing you wasn't the way you say something you mean only lightly. I started noticing other things in that same looking back way. Things I had done without examining why. 6 months earlier I had noticed the drip line on her east greenhouse section running wrong, losing pressure every morning, wasting water she couldn't afford to waste. I hadn't mentioned it to her. I had just ordered the fittings from the supply house and driven over one morning when her truck wasn't there and replaced the line myself. It had taken 2 hours. I had loaded my tools back in the truck and left before she came back from town. I told myself it was what any neighbor would do. The more honest version was that I had wanted to fix it before she found it herself. Had wanted her morning to work better without her having to know I had been the reason it did. She had never said a word about it. I had assumed she hadn't noticed. I understood now that she had noticed and had let me pretend otherwise. I started noticing things I had been working hard not to notice. Hannah knew which days I hauled cattle to the vet, and which weeks the workload made me difficult to talk to. She had never brought food to any other neighbor, not once, not anywhere along the road. Along our road. I knew that. Had known it for a long time without examining what it meant. She fixed her own fences, managed her own accounts, negotiated prices that would have made Frank proud, and still found time every Sunday without fail to walk across a field with something for me. Last spring, after a heavy rain took down a section of her north fence, I had loaded timber and tools into the truck before breakfast and driven over without waiting to be asked. We worked on it most of the day. When we finished, she handed me a bottle of water and sat down in the grass beside me and asked how much she owed me. I told her nothing. She gave me a look then, the same quiet, level look she'd given me this morning. I hadn't understood it at the time. Now I was afraid I did. For almost 2 weeks after that Sunday, I kept the words at a careful distance. I was 48, Hannah was 26. The math was plain, and the implications were plainer. I was old enough to be her father. If things had gone a different way, I had already had a long marriage, and a wife I still didn't know how to live without. And Hannah Brooks deserved someone who could match her pace, who would still be standing beside her when she was my age, who wouldn't carry all the weight of a life already mostly lived. I told myself all of this with great conviction. I wasn't sure I believed any of it anymore. Connor Wells had been circling Hannah's farm for nearly a year. He was 30 years old, ran the county's largest agricultural supply and equipment business, and had the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up with money and knowing how to use it. Tall, well-dressed, polished without being slick, he showed up at farm events with the right handshake and the right questions, and he had been making his interest in Hannah clear since the previous autumn. I had seen him at the equipment dealership in town, seen him at the farmer's market talking to her about her goat cheese operation with the focused attention of someone who had done his research. He wasn't a bad man. I had no honest reason to call him one. He was just there, in places I was not. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, I went into the feed store to pick up mineral supplements for the cattle. Two men near the counter were talking about the harvest festival coming up at the end of the month. Connor had asked Hannah to go with him. She hadn't given him an answer yet. One of the men laughed and said that was as good as a yes. The other said it was about time she found someone who could grow alongside her instead of just next to her. I stood at the shelf pretending to read a label I couldn't see. I had no standing to feel anything about what those men were saying. I had never told Hannah how I felt. I had pretended not to understand her on the morning of the preserves. If she chose Connor Wells, it would be the practical, reasonable choice. The choice that made sense from every angle I could name. I drove the supplements home and unloaded the truck and sat on the porch as the light changed and looked across the field toward her place. Anna's voice came back to me then. Not clearly, not in any specific phrase, but in the way things come back when you've been carrying them long enough. She had told me once, during the last winter, that she didn't want me to turn whatever years I had left into some kind of penance. I had been angry when she said it. I told her not to talk like she was already gone. She just held my hand and said, "You're going to keep living, Cole. The only question is whether you're actually going to live, or just keep going through the same motions in the same rooms." I had thought, in the 2 years since, that keeping the farm running and staying upright and showing up every morning counted as living. I was starting to understand it didn't. That same evening I walked east across the field. Hannah was in the greenhouse, checking the irrigation lines, the way she did this time of year. She saw me through the glass before I reached the door and kept working while I came in. The warm vegetable smell of the greenhouse closed around me. She didn't stop what she was doing. "Hannah," I said. "Cole, I've been thinking about something you said." She moved to the next row without looking up. "I say a lot of things. You know which one I mean." She set the irrigation gauge down and turned to face me. I took a slow breath. "That morning you said you kept not believing me. I need to know what you meant." She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone deciding how honest to be. Then she walked a few steps closer. "You said I was wasting my Sunday mornings on someone your age," she said. "But I don't bring you bread because I'm looking for someone younger. I bring it because—" She paused. "Because I care about the person standing in front of me. The one who drove over in the rain to fix my fence before I even asked. The one who remembers my father's birthday. The one who has never once made me feel like I was more trouble than I was worth." My throat tightened. "Hannah, I'm 48. I know. You're 26. I also know how old I am. That's not a small thing we can just set aside." "I never said we should set it aside," she said. "I said I didn't believe you when you used it as a reason to stop talking." I searched her face for any uncertainty, any sign she was speaking from something temporary or confused. There wasn't any. She had lived next door to me for 3 years. She had seen me on bad days, the days when I was short and stubborn and difficult, when grief made me impatient, and solitude made me too quiet. She hadn't been watching some careful version of me. "I'm not in love with an idea of you," she said, her voice quiet enough that the greenhouse hum almost covered it. "I know exactly who you are." I looked at her, and I believed her, which made what I said next harder. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." She nodded slowly. Her expression didn't collapse. She just looked at me with a steadiness that made the back of my throat burn. "I understand." She turned back to her work. "But don't decide what's best for my life on my behalf," she said, without looking at me. "That's not yours to do." After that evening, things between us changed, though neither of us moved or spoke of it. Hannah still came on Sundays, but she was careful now. She left the food at the door and asked about the cattle, and left within a few minutes. She wasn't cold exactly, just exact, just very precisely a neighbor. And that precision was worse than any argument would have been. I started listening for her boots on the porch steps. I started making extra coffee before 7, even when I'd told myself I wasn't expecting anyone. I noticed when she laughed at something from across the field. I noticed when her truck was gone all day and I didn't know where she'd been. I noticed the particular silence of the house on the days she didn't come. I told myself I was just used to her company. I knew I was lying. A week before the harvest festival, I was at the farm store when Hannah came in for seedling trays. We worked around each other through the aisles for a few minutes before I asked if she'd made a decision about the festival. She looked at me for a moment before answering. Connor asked me again. I heard he had. I haven't told him yes yet. She was giving me space to say something. All I had to do was ask her to go with me instead, and she would likely tell Connor no before the end of the day. I looked at her and thought about the 22 years between us and every question that came with them. Connor Wells is a good man, I said. The warmth left her face. Are you giving me a reference for him now? He's young, he understands the farming business. Are you trying to talk me into a man I didn't ask about? I turned to straighten jars that were already straight. I'm trying to say you should think about your future. Hannah was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was very even and very cold. You keep deciding things for me, she said. You decided I was too young for you to consider. You decided Connor was good for me without asking what I wanted. And now you're straightening jars to avoid looking at me. She closed the box she'd been packing, said goodbye, and walked out. 3 days later, I heard she'd told Connor yes. On the night of the harvest festival, I stayed home. I told myself I had work to finish. I finished it by 7, and sat at the kitchen table, with nothing in front of me. From the window I could see the distant lights of town, too far to make out anything specific, just a glow above the tree line. I thought about Hannah there in some dress she almost never wore, laughing at something Connor said, looking like someone who had finally made a sensible choice. I opened the refrigerator and took out the last of the bread she had left Sunday. I stood at the counter and ate it without tasting anything. Just before 9, I heard tires on the gravel. I looked out and saw a truck stop at the end of the lane. Hannah's truck. She got out alone. She was wearing a deep blue dress under an open coat, her auburn hair down around her shoulders instead of tied back the way she wore it for work. I had never seen her look like that. She came up onto the porch. Why are you here? I asked. I left early. Where's Connor? He drove me to my place. I walked over from there. I opened the door and stepped back. She came inside and stood in the middle of the room, still holding her coat closed, like she wasn't fully sure she should have come. Connor asked if we could start seeing each other properly, she said. What did you tell him? I said no. I kept my voice even. Why? She looked at me for a long moment, the look that didn't need decoration. Because I'm not in love with him. Maybe you haven't given him enough time. Don't do that, Cole. Do what? Push me towards someone I don't want, so you don't have to face what you feel. I looked away. You don't know what I feel. Then tell me. The room went quiet. My eyes went to the photograph of Anna on the shelf by the window. Hannah followed my gaze. I loved my wife, I said. I know. I thought I'd never feel that way about anyone else. I'm not asking you to forget her. If I let myself love you, what does that say about what Anna and I had? It says you loved her, Hannah said, and that you're still alive. I closed my eyes. I'm afraid of what it means. She didn't move closer. Do you honestly think Anna wanted you to stay alone in that house for the rest of your life? I couldn't answer. The exact conversation I'd avoided for 2 years sat in the silence between us. Hannah's voice was quieter when she went on. I don't want to take her place. I can't. I just need to know if there's any room left. I looked at her. Behind the steadiness in her face was something real and tired, the look of someone who had been patient for a long time and was running out of ways to be patient without being asked to leave. I don't know if I can do this, I admitted. She nodded. Her eyes were bright. I understand. She turned toward the door. At the threshold she stopped. But I can't keep crossing that field every Sunday morning and pretending I'm only a neighbor who makes too much bread. Then she left. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after her footsteps faded. Then I turned around and saw the 2 cups I had already set out on the counter that morning. And I understood I wasn't only afraid of beginning something with her. I was afraid I had already lost her before I ever let myself try. The Sunday after the festival, Hannah didn't come. It was the first Sunday in 2 years the porch stayed empty. I stood in the kitchen looking at those 2 coffee cups and felt the full weight of every choice I had made by not making one. 2 weeks passed. We exchanged messages about farm business. She stored some of her equipment in my east barn during winter. We split orders from the same suppliers to save on freight. Every message stayed exactly on the subject of whatever it was about. No extra sentences, no extensions, just the transaction, then done. I caught myself watching for her truck when I went out to check the herd. I checked the east fence line more than it needed checking, because the east fence faced her property and gave me a clear view of her greenhouse. One afternoon I saw her working with a hired hand on the irrigation upgrade, and I stood watching too long before I turned away. I asked myself what exactly I was protecting her from. The age difference was real. I would grow old before her, and there might come a day when she would have to carry more than her share of the weight. That was true, but choosing to refuse her didn't guarantee she would be happier with someone younger. It only guaranteed that both of us would carry whatever came from the choice I had made for her without asking. On a Thursday evening, I did something I had not done in 2 years. I went to the East Room, the room Anna had used for the farm accounts, the room I had kept locked since the week of her funeral. The key was where I'd left it, on the hook inside the pantry door. I stood in front of that door for a long time before I turned it. The room was the same as I'd left it. Dust on the desk, the ledger stacked the way she'd always stacked them, her old cardigan on the back of the chair, a photograph on the windowsill of the two of us standing in front of the barn in a winter I couldn't quite place. I sat down in front of the desk and let myself remember her. Not the last months, the years before that. The ordinary years, the evenings she fell asleep on the couch reading seed catalogs. The way she always burned one side of whatever she was baking and pretended it was intentional. The arguments about the equipment budget that always ended with her being right. Anna had known me better than I knew myself in most ways, and one of the things she had always said was that I had a gift for constructing excellent reasons not to do the thing I actually wanted to do. I could build a case against anything, and the longer I built it, the more certain I became that I was being sensible rather than afraid. I sat in that room for almost an hour, then I started cleaning it. I didn't throw anything away. I sorted carefully, kept what mattered, set some things aside for Anna's sister. I opened the curtains and let the late light in for the first time in 2 years. And then I went to find my boots. Hannah was in the greenhouse when I crossed the field, checking the seedling trays, moving through the rows with that particular focused quiet she had when she was working. She saw me come through the glass door, and didn't stop what she was doing. But she waited. "Do you have a minute? You can say what you need to say." "I was wrong," I said. She kept her hands on the tray she was holding. "About what, specifically?" "About all of it. I used the age difference like a wall because I didn't want to admit I was scared. Scared of hurting you. Scared of what people would think. Scared that you'd look back 10 years from now and wish you'd made a different choice." "Those things might still happen," she said. "I know. So what changed?" "I understood that you have the right to decide which risks are worth taking," I said. "And I don't get to make that calculation for you." She set the tray down and looked at me steadily. "I should have said this a long time ago," I went on. "I can't promise you that people won't talk. I can't promise you that in 20 years you won't have things to carry that I put down before you. I can't give you a life without a past in it. I never asked for any of those things. I know, but I needed to say them out loud before I could say anything else." I took a breath. "What I can promise is that I won't treat you like someone who doesn't know what she wants. I can promise I'll be honest, even when it's easier not to be. And I can promise that if we do this, I won't hold back half of it because I feel guilty about what came before." Hannah looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I thought she might not answer at all. Then, quietly, "You took 2 years and 4 weeks to say that. I'm a slow thinker." The corner of her mouth moved. "I know." It was the first time she had said those words without them carrying the weight of a door closing. She invited me in for coffee. We sat across from each other at her kitchen table, the same table where Connor had left flowers twice. I had always noticed, and agreed we would take it slowly. Not slowly because we were unsure, but slowly because neither of us were people who needed to rush past the ordinary parts. I agreed with that completely. Our first real date was in Billings, almost 2 hours away. I drove that distance on purpose. I didn't want the first time we sat across from each other in a restaurant to be conducted under the observation of everyone who knew our separate stories. Hannah understood without my having to explain it. The evening was still slightly awkward at first. I kept glancing at the other tables, kept doing the mental arithmetic that I'd been doing for weeks, kept asking myself if people were watching. About halfway through the meal, Hannah set her fork down and looked at me. "If you ask me one more time tonight whether I'm sure about this, I'm going to drive myself home." I laughed. It was the first time in a long time that I'd laughed at my own fear instead of feeding it. After dinner, we walked along the street near the restaurant. When we got back to the truck, Hannah reached for my hand, without making anything of it, just reached over and took it. I looked down at her fingers wrapped around mine in the cold Montana dark, and I understood that this wasn't a betrayal of what I'd had before. It was something else entirely. I leaned down and kissed her. Careful, unhurried, the way you cross a threshold you've been standing in front of for too long. When we pulled apart, she rested her forehead against mine. "You shouldn't waste your Sundays on someone my age," she said, with the particular tone of someone quoting something back. I went still. She started laughing. "I'm sorry, I've been saving that." I shook my head, and then I laughed too. All the way home. For the first time, the years between us didn't feel like a wall. They were just a fact. Something we both saw clearly and had chosen to step past anyway. Word got around town quickly, the way it always does in a place this size. Most people were kind, or at least quiet about it. A few said what a few always say, that Hannah was too young to know better, that I was taking advantage of a girl who didn't have anyone else looking out for her. What surprised me was how little those voices seemed to affect Hannah. When the woman at the market asked if she'd really thought this through, Hannah answered without heat, "I manage a 40-acre agricultural operation, negotiate contracts, and employ 4 people. I think I can also decide who I want to spend time with." After that, no one said it to her face again. Connor Wells came to see her once. He was decent about it. No scene, no bitterness. He asked if she was sure. She told him she was, and that he had done nothing wrong, and that she hoped he found someone who felt about him the way she didn't. He accepted that and stepped back. I respected him more for it than I had before. He came to see me once too, just to say that she was someone worth keeping, and that he hoped I knew that. I told him I did. For nearly a year after we started, Hannah and I kept our own farms. We didn't hurry into anything. Days, we each ran our own operations. Evenings, we ate together at one place or the other. On weekends, we walked the fence lines between our properties and talked about how the 2 operations might work together over time. Shared equipment costs, a combined farm stand, joint purchasing agreements with the suppliers we both used. Hannah had thought it through in more detail than I had, which didn't surprise me. She presented the structure cleanly. Legal ownership of each piece of land would stay separate. Any shared business would be documented properly. No one would be dependent on anyone else without agreement. I told her I was glad she'd said it that way. She said she knew I'd feel that way, which was partly why she'd said it. In May, a late storm came through and took most of the roof off one of her greenhouses. I had workers at her place before first light. We rebuilt the frame and moved the seedlings to safety, and worked until dark getting everything tarped. When the last of it was secured, Hannah was standing in the middle of the damaged greenhouse in her work clothes, streaked with mud, hair pulled back from her face. She looked at me from across the space. "You showed up again before I asked you," she said. "I'm starting to think it's just what you do." "Comes with the fence line," I said. She smiled, slowly, the real one. "I think it comes with you." That night I brought her back to the house. On the kitchen table I had set out an apple pie I had made from a recipe she'd given me once, almost offhandedly, when I mentioned Anna used to make them. It was lopsided. The crust was dark on one side where I'd misjudged the temperature. Hannah stood looking at it for a moment without saying anything. "You made this. I tried. I can see that." I took the ring from my jacket pocket. It was simple. No stones, no ceremony, just a plain gold band, because I knew her well enough to know she didn't like things that needed maintenance. "You brought me bread for 2 years before I understood what it meant," I said. "And then you came back across the field one night and told me exactly who I was, and I still needed another month to stop arguing with myself. You were patient in a way I hadn't earned." I got down on one knee beside the table. "Hannah Brooks, I can't promise you easy. I can't promise you uncomplicated or without history, or any of the things that might have been simpler if I'd met you at a different time. What I can promise is that every day I have left, I intend to actually be in." She laughed and then pressed her mouth together and her eyes went bright. "You're proposing next to a burnt pie. I thought it added something. It really doesn't." She was laughing and not laughing at the same time. She looked at me. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." We married in September, on the strip of land between our two properties, the way it had always seemed right to do it. Small ceremony, family and close friends and the neighbors who had watched us separately for long enough that they felt like witnesses to the whole thing. The day before the wedding, I drove to the cemetery and sat for a while with Anna. I brought flowers from the garden, the ones she had always kept along the east wall. I told her about Hannah. I told her about the bread and the fence repair and the morning I had said something foolish about my own age, and Hannah had looked at me and said she didn't believe me. I said I was grateful for everything we had been to each other, and I told her I was finally ready to do what she had asked me to do, to keep living, not just keep going. Standing in front of Hannah on our wedding day, I didn't feel like one thing was ending and another beginning. I felt like I was simply being honest about what I had and what I still wanted, and the fact that both of those things could exist in the same life at the same time. After we married, Hannah moved into the farmhouse. The east room became our shared office. One corner still held Anna's old desk and a few photographs. Hannah never asked me to move them. On the new desk by the window sat her laptop, the ledgers for both operations, and a photograph of the two of us taken at the Harvest Festival the following year, which was the only harvest festival I ever attended, because Hannah liked dancing and I liked watching her. We divided the work according to what we were good at rather than what was traditional. She handled the accounts, the online sales, the branding for the joint farm stand we had built along the road. I handled the cattle, the equipment, the storage systems. Some days I cooked and it didn't turn out well. Some days she fell asleep on the couch in her work clothes before 9 o'clock. Our life was not perfect. There were days when I felt the years between us as a physical thing, when I moved slower than I wanted to, or when she mentioned something and I realized it had happened while I was already full of a different life. There were moments when Hannah worried quietly about a future that might arrive unevenly. We learned to say those things out loud instead of carrying them separately. That was the agreement, underneath all the other agreements, that the things we were most afraid of were also the things most worth naming. Our daughter was born in January, 3 years after the wedding. When I understood I was going to be a father at 51, my first response was not happiness, but fear. Fear that I wouldn't be able to keep up with a child who deserved a father with more runway ahead of him. Fear of what it would mean for Hannah if something happened to me before our daughter was grown. One evening on the porch, I told Hannah all of it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took my hand. "You can't control how long you get," she said. "You can only decide how present you are in the time you have. What if I'm not enough for her?" Hannah was quiet for a moment. Then, "You came across a field in the dark to fix my fence when I didn't even know it needed fixing. You sat with Anna until the very last day. You have been showing up for the people in your life your whole life, Cole." She looked at me. "You've known how to be a father for a long time. You just didn't have anyone calling you that. We named her June for the month Anna had loved best, which Hannah had suggested herself and which made me unable to speak for a moment when she did. The first time I held her, the fear was still there, but beside it was something else, a gratitude larger than anything I'd known how to put into words in a long time. On a Sunday morning 3 years after our wedding, I was checking the south fence when I heard the gate behind me. I turned and saw Hannah coming across the field, June on her hip, already wide-eyed and serious, the way she always was in New Air, auburn-haired like her mother, and watching the world like she was already taking notes. Hannah was carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle in her free hand. I opened the gate, and she came through and set the bundle in my arms. Bread, still warm, from the same recipe she had always used. I looked up at her. You made too much again. She smiled. I always make too much. I held June while Hannah adjusted the wrap around the bread, and I looked at the two of them in the early morning light. The field behind them, the tree line, the house beyond it that had been too quiet for too many years. And I said the same thing I had said on a September morning 4 years ago, when I had meant it as a deflection. You shouldn't waste your Sunday mornings on someone my age. Hannah looked at me. Her expression was the same as it had always been. Steady, direct, a little amused and a little exasperated by me, the way it usually was. I keep not believing you, she said. June reached for my face with one small hand, and I let her. The three of us walked together toward the house. The bread was warm through the cloth. The morning was wide and clear. And for the first time in a long time, maybe the first time ever, the words I had said felt like the truth instead of a shield. Not an excuse, just a small, honest wish. More time with this. With them. With a life I had once been convinced I was too late to have.